All right. Herzlich willkommen. Welcome. My name is Sabine von Mehring, and I'm the director of the Center for German and European Studies here at Brandeis University, one of the many units that Karen has brought together to host this two-day event. And we already had a very powerful experience last night, and it's going to continue this afternoon. So you're in for a treat. For those joining us for the very first time, Brandeis University was established in 1948, named after the first Jewish Supreme Court justice, and is until today the only non-sectarian Jewish-founded university in the United States. Karen has listed all the co-sponsors, so I'm not going to go over that. Because we have a lot in store for you today, and I want to keep my remarks very short. I want to thank Dr. Karen Frostig, who is the brains behind this project, and I'll introduce her in more detail in a moment. I understand that this day of remembrance is really a reunion of sorts for many of the descendants of the Jungfernhof concentration camp. And, you know, the Nazis always had a thing for names, didn't they? So I just want to welcome you all again to Brandeis, and we're happy to host you today. I hope the opportunity to be here together will strengthen the bonds between you and broaden the scope of the group, and help you strengthen you continue to do the work that you have been doing, the work of remembrance and of carrying forth this memory for future generations. One word about the mix-up with the luncheon. We would love to host a luncheon, but we had over 100 some people RSVP'd, which we can simply not handle on a weekday here on campus. So you're on your own, but there is a sheet at the back on the table with all the options, and there are plenty of options, and they are delicious, and there's all you can eat buffet, so you will not be starving. And maybe you can even take lunch outside. It's such a beautiful weather. That's also, of course, just for you. We made that happen. So let me introduce our hostess really, and main person behind this all. Karen Frostig is professor of art who teaches at Lesley University's Graduate School of Arts and Social Sciences, the College of Art and Design, and in the arts program. She's also in the arts program in the Graduate School of Education. She is a public memory artist, a writer, cultural historian, and community organizer. And I know she organized all of you, so that's certainly a success. Here at Brandeis, she's affiliated with the Women's Studies Research Center and the Hadassah Brandeis Institute. And it is probably fair to say that she has worked on this project to some extent all her life, but certainly a great number of years. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Karen Frostig. Thank you.
Is taller than. Thank you so much for that introduction, for being a partner in this project and helping to make it happen. So one of the wisdoms of working in the public environment is to work cooperatively and to realize that you can't do it alone, and that you've got to have other partners with you. You've got to make this happen together, which is what we did last night. And I will just mention briefly an observation from last night. We gathered in small groups talking about memory, and I watched descendants point to walls covered with scrolling names, exclaiming, "There they are, that's our family." People were happy, proud, bringing these names to life. That was the purpose of the program, and it happened. And the idea of restoring dignity to victims and their families took place in Sherman Hall on this campus, and it was quite remarkable. This morning provides us with a different story. When I developed the topic, memory and ethics of memorialization, I had one thing in mind. How can we address the erasure of the Jungfernhof concentration camp and establish a permanent memorial at the camp? Creating a memorial representing 3 countries responsible for crimes of murder at Jungfernhof was a powerful idea. But I cannot claim credit for bringing these 3 panelists together. They work together frequently on committees dealing with the Nazi era, but not specifically dealing with the history of the Jungfernhof concentration camp. They're coming to Brandeis to talk about history, memory, and justice. They are not afraid to be here. They have devoted their life's work to truth, memory, and justice. Panelists has comforted so many survivors who have in turn comforted Hannah. This is the strange thing about this work. It is not depressing, it is inspirational. We speak about the unspeakable and we remember what it means to be human. And there is an unusual amount of generosity in the air. So why are we here now? Why are we addressing the story about this forgotten camp? The site was recently turned into a recreation park. How will a memorial occupy space in a recreation park? I understand there is no opposition to building a memorial at the park, but it is unclear what the next steps are. Who would take the initiative to build a memorial at Jungfernhof? What explains the delay? There's an additional question about obligation. What does the word obligation mean? Does it mean different things to descendants than to nations? Who pays for memorial? How do we engage local communities in memory? What is the process of moving from forgetting to remembering? And how do we pursue a memorial for a concentration camp in the midst of rising global anti-Semitism? So these are all questions that may be discussed today. There are many more questions, but I'm going to leave it to Laurel, who is going to be the moderator of our panel. And I will introduce her after we first speak with Peter Stein, who is coming up to talk about his story. And I'm not sure if this is in order, out of order. I think we're in order. We are in order. Let me just introduce you. Born in 1936, and Peter will have a chance to talk about his story. Born in 1936 in Nuremberg, there were 4 transports, 4 cities that Jungfernhof became the place of the destination. Peter was liberated from Bergen-Belsen in May 1945, along with his mother and younger brother. Younger brother, meaning that he was at the camp at age 2. Can you imagine? They emigrated to the US in March 1947, graduating from the University of Missouri School of Mines and Metallurgy. I don't even know that. He spent 10 years as a metallurgical engineer before switching careers to become a middle school science teacher. And education, as we know, is the model of hope in the world. It is called the noble profession. He taught for 30 years before retiring in 2001. Peter and his wife, Julie, have 2 sons, Joe and Bill, and 3 grandchildren. And so often survivors talk about their legacies, their children, their grandchildren. It is that notion that survival is defiance to some extent, but we will hear from Peter and hear what he has to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you. First of all, I want to introduce you to my almost 5-year-old and 2-year-old brother. I want you all to sort of disbelieve your lying eyes and assume that I'm a 5-year-old telling you this story. After spending many days in a crowded train compartment with another family of 4, we arrived at a small train station which was surrounded by an all-white atmosphere. When I got off the train, it seemed as if we were enclosed by walls of snow, and the road was also a dirty white. I remember walking, sometimes carrying a small bag or holding on to my almost 3-year-old brother's hand. I assume my mother got tired of carrying it. It was a long way. I was soon fascinated by observing a woman with a fur stole and a heavy coat who was staggering in front of us. It was the fact that her underpants were slipping down that got my attention. When she fell, and my mother cradled her, I was responsible for my brother and all our small packages. The woman had died. People kept walking past us. We waited until a luggage-laden truck came to pick up her body. My father was one of the men on the truck. I do not remember how we got to the stone building in which we were housed, nor do I recall how many people were able to be in a structure meant for animals that had little light, no heat, or water. The lack of water was emphasized when all the children in the building were given a small container to get water to wash a young woman who had fallen into the septic system. My memory also fails me as to where I got the water. I do recall a body of water, a pond or a stream. All of us small children must have been put outside until that girl was clean, because I do remember walking around the area and trying to push an abandoned baby carriage. This is also the area where I believe I heard my first shots. All the children pointed at a large animal near the body of the woman. The guard said it was a wolf and fired his rifle. I have no other memories of Jungfernhof. The next thing I recall is arriving at the Riga Ghetto. This was the second stop on my family's odyssey. It ended in April 1945 at Bergen-Belsen. At the right-hand corner, that's me holding on to my brother. The next picture I'm going to show you is of Nuremberg after the war at what had been at the Jewish home, old age home before the war. And it is probably one of the most unusual pictures of the Holocaust. And it is unusual because who fit most of the people? Again, my brother and I are there, and the rest of the people, even to my eyes now, at my non-5-year-old age, look old. And these are also survivors. They're all survivors of Theresienstadt, which was the show camp that was used to tell the world that the Nazis weren't doing what they were doing. And the people were elected or selected for Ravensbruck because the men were all heroes of World War I. My maternal grandparents died there, as my grandfather was a hero of World War I. in terms of what we've been sort of talking about, remembering the past. One of the things that we have to do is think about that the past, which is always with us, can be an anchor or a beacon. My life, I've been able to use light as it came and the anchor as a steadying thing, something to remember, but not to hold you back. So it is that search that I hope we can all continue. Thank you.
Is this, yes, is this going on? Okay. Peter, thank you so much. We have a descendants meeting, we meet monthly. And Peter is a faithful attendee at this meeting that we have discussing our memories, our thoughts. So thank you for being here. Thank you for speaking. You sent me your what you were going to say, and I read it. But hearing it from you, from your voice, is such a different experience. It is a kind of, and I don't use this word lightly, but it is a performance. It is something that we can now observe and witness and share with you. And thank you so much for doing that. I'm going to very briefly introduce our other two speakers that we're doing remotely. And thank goodness for technology. We're now all experts with technology, so we get to do this. So Fred Zeilberger is actually, it's a little confusing, the three images, but Fred is on the bottom. And Fred is, he also comes regularly to our meetings, and he will introduce himself as he does. What's very interesting in this dynamic is that Pete was with his brother, Sam. And Fred was with his best friend, who became his best friend, Herbert Mai, who cannot join us today. But it's very interesting. We had 5 survivors, and you'll see a video of this later today. 2 of them had intimate relationships going through this camp, going through other camps. And there's some discussion about what that means in terms of survival, to have that kind of relationship with someone important as you move, as you survive. So that is part, and that particular story is also interesting to hear from Fred, that we'll see what he says. I have no idea what he'll say. I guess he's ready. Fred, are you ready to talk with us?
I'm ready. Can you hear me?
And one other thing about Fred, he has a great sense of humor.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We're happy to see you.
My name is Fred Zeilberger. I was born on December 16, 1929. I'm 94 years old. I was with the first transport from Ravensbruck and Nuremberg taken to the outskirts of Riga in Latvia to the camp Jungfernhof. Jungfernhof was not even a concentration camp, it was an extermination camp because very few people survived, but I'm one of them. I was in Jungfernhof from the beginning to the end when it was dissolved. Then I was taken to the ghetto, and from the ghetto I was taken to Kaiserwald, another concentration camp. And when the Russians came closer, I was taken on a ship to Poland and went to Stutthof and another camp. And I was liberated in April of 1945 by the Russian army. And here I am today. I live in the United States. I came here in 1947. I'm married. I have 3 children. We're married 68 years. I live in the same house 63 years in Long Island, and this country was very good to me. Any questions? Any wants to ask something?
I have a question. It's really just, well, I have 2. Can you just summarize very quickly your relationship with Herbert May, because it's so fascinating.
The relationship with Herbert May, we lived in Würzburg in the same street. I lived number 6 and he lived number 12. We are both the same age. He's a couple of months older than me. We were taken in 1941 with the first transport from Würzburg to Nuremberg, and we were together most of the time. We were liberated without our parents, and we went. The Russians couldn't understand why we want to go back to Germany. We should go to Russia, because when I went in concentration camp, I was not even 12 years old. And we went back to Germany, to Würzburg, and we lived also in an old age home. And we were there till in the end of 46, and we came to the United States as a war orphan. President Truman at that time signed, you didn't need an affidavit, and we came here. And I was so sick on the ship, they didn't let me off the ship. The SS Ernie Pyle and took me to Ellis Island, where I stayed a couple of weeks. And after it was better, they let me go, and I went in an orphanage in the Bronx in New York. And after that, I lived with an aunt and uncle. My father was one of 13 siblings. Half of them left Germany and went to Israel, to Latin America, and the United States. And that's the story. And we're still friends. And we came, number one, we came on the same ship to New York in 1947. And we were drafted in the American Army together in 1951 in the Korean War. And we're still friends. He's not doing too well at the present time. He lives in Florida. But he's hanging in, that's all.
Thank you so much. One other detail about Herbert May, which is fascinating, is that there were 2 boys that were 13 years old that were bar mitzvahed at the camp. And so Herbert May was one of those. So we found him, he came to the screen. I mean, it's rather a remarkable story. And Fred, you've also, and this is tough to say, but you were you dug graves at the camp. And this is a question, you know, in terms of evidence, in terms of digging graves, in terms of that exploration. That's something that we're doing. So these kinds of, you know, testimonies are really very important. And thank you so much for contributing to this group and helping us have a focus for what we're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We're now going to also meet with Fred Laser, who lives in Hamburg. He grew up in Hamburg. He was at Jungfernhof, and now he lives in Hamburg. He was not able to join us digitally, and I believe you have a 1-minute presentation from him. But you will see him also this afternoon on a longer video.
My name is Fred Laser. I'm 96 years old, and I was with my mother in Jungfernhof. My father and brother were in another camp, Sauerspils, and eventually were shot in the forest. And we didn't know that for a long time, because we had no connection to the other camp. But we found out later that that was even worse than we did. My mother and I were lucky, we were working, and I think the commandant liked my mother and not me, but left me alive because of my mother. And yeah.
So we get bits and pieces and we put it together in our head of what we can imagine this camp was like. And there were no photographs, no documents of the camp. So it really is up to us to imagine from these descriptions. We are now moving to our panel, which I'm thrilled that we have the opportunity that you came all the way across the sea from Europe to here, and that you're giving us a different perspective. And we really value that. And we also have the happy occasion to welcome Laurel Leff, who's well known at Brandeis. We're in a group together. And the group is Holocaust History, Remembrance, Research, something like that. There you go. Sitting next to another member of that group, and someone else is here from that group. So here we are, two more. Perfect. So we're all here together. So we meet, we talk. There's a lot of conversation that goes on. We all have very different histories. So Laurel is the professor of journalism and the associate director of Jewish studies at Northeastern. You may be familiar with her books. Her latest book is well worth saving, American University's Life and Death Decisions on Refugees from Nazi Europe. And her other book, which many people know, is Buried by the Times, the Holocaust in America's Most Important Newspaper. She's lively, she's incredibly inquisitive. She is a journalist for sure. And we welcome Laurel as moderator. Do you want to go to the podium?
No, I'm not going to talk for long, so I think I'll just stay here because my function is to introduce and also to be the timekeeper. So if I start being rude, you'll know why. It's really important that we keep to the schedule, and that is part of my job. But I am really honored to be here for this remarkable event, and I so appreciate Peter and Fred's comments to get us started, and particularly to take us to that location in a really meaningful way. And I know we'll be talking more about it, but I think there's nothing like seeing it through their eyes, and particularly and very sadly through their children's eyes. So I am really honored to be here. And I also have to say just one word about Karen, which is it's just amazing she put together this event. I mean, I get exhausted just thinking about how much planning and work it took to do, let alone to do it. So it really is a tribute to her persistence and determination and organizing skills. So I think we're all in her debt for that. So with that, I will introduce our panelists. And one thing I should say to begin with is I am not going to be able to do credit to their biographies. These will be very short introductions. But for those of you who want to know more, and I think you all should, in the program, there's more detailed biographies so you can see how much and exactly what they've done in this area of memory in the Holocaust. So our first speaker, who is in the middle there, is Thomas Lutz, who is was the head of the Memorial Museum's Department of the Topography of Terror Foundation in Berlin, a truly amazing museum, until his retirement in the summer of 2023. And he currently advises governments, national and international institutions, and memorial museums. And then we have Hanna Lessig, who's to my left, and she is the General Secretary of the National Fund of the Republic of Austria, and she's responsible for administering the National Fund of the Republic of Austria for victims of National Socialism and the Fund for the Restoration of the Jewish Cemeteries in Austria. She also managed the General Settlement Fund for Victims of National Socialism, which was dissolved in 2002 after fulfilling its restitution and compensations mission. So that in and of itself is quite remarkable. And then over there at the end is Ilya Lensky. He is the director of the Museum Jews in Latvia and an editor of several books on Latvian Jewish history, most recently Holocaust Commemoration in Latvia in the Course of Time. He is a Latvian delegate to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And those are our panelists, and we'll start with Thomas.
So to start with the presentation, before the settle, I can say thanks very much for the invitation. It's a real honor for me to be here. I admire your work Karen, I'm familiar with this since 1950. It's a Vienna project, and I hope
Can't hear you.
here and with my work I can support you a little bit with an important idea and important project also together with Ilya and others to have a memorial and memorial museum. I can do it here. Memorial Museum in Jungfernhof. What I would like to do, and now it's not so easy to switch from what we've heard from the survivors. Maybe you've heard that I'm, on the one hand, I'm a museums professionalist because I've worked for the Topographie of Terror for a long period of time, but also I'm a member of a German association, Protestant association called Action Reconciliation Service for Peace, and with them since 1974 I had many talks, many co-working with survivors, and among others, I was for 30 years, I was the chair of the board for the Memorial Museums Sachsenhausen and Ravensbruck, and so also I have to work together with many survivors from all over the world. So what I would like to do now is to bring these two areas together, and you could, no, you can't see my, my presentation. No, it's back. So you can see what I would like to do is to speak a little bit about memory and the ethics of memorialization. I will do it more general, and then Hannah Lissing and Ilya Lensky will go deeper into some specific explanation examples. If we speak here about memory, so just to let you know, if I speak about memory, so I speak about the memory about the victims of the Nazi regime. That means I speak about the memory about people who suffered under the Nazi regime in Germany since 1933, and especially during the World War, where the Germans were supported also by the Allies and the collaborators in the crimes they committed in the occupied areas. So this is, this is 80 years ago, more or less 80 years ago. And so what we have to think about, that we also have not only the history, what happened during the Nazi regime, but also the history of memorialization. And I think especially in this professional field, we have to have this in mind. Also, the never again was very important for the people who survived the camps. Nevertheless, we have to see that we have all over the world many other state crimes, mass murders, war crimes and crimes against humanity, but I will deal mostly with the Holocaust, which is from our perspective a part of the Nazi crimes, and also the Holocaust. If we speak about the memory about it, it's a worldwide memory now. It has different characteristics, so the discussion is different in Germany compared to the United States, compared to Austria, compared to Latvia, and to compare maybe all the other countries. So quite often what is important to have this national characteristics is also the question in which way they were involved in other state crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity between 1945 and now. And what I would like to do now is to make you a little bit familiar with two papers which, from my perspective, are fundamentals in dealing with the Nazi crimes. But also, if we have this focus of the Nazi crimes, I think we have to discuss very general questions and maybe ethic things if we deal with these examples. So the first example is we had 15 years ago now, you can see here the people, this were the chairpersons of the international committees dealing with memorial museums in the state of Germany. Most of them unfortunately died until now. Only the second person from left, Noah Flug, is alive now. He's a president of the international. Entschuldigung, Marian Turski, excuse me, it was my mistake. Marian Turski is the chairperson of the international committee of the survivors of the Memorial Museum in Auschwitz, but also because they were old, so they had the idea it's necessary to write a bequest, and maybe I can only just point out some of the words and sentences there. If you go to the internet, you will find this bequest. So you just ask for survivor's bequest and Google will find it for you. But important is that for them, they said, oh, to all our lives, we would like to inform the young people about what happened. That's we would like that they understand our experience and our encounter. And what they also believe that the world has not learned enough from their history. And that's the reason why they think that remembrance and commemoration is also important nowadays. So if you see the pictures here, you can see people who participated in this conference 2009 from different backgrounds, different nations, mostly from nations from European nations. Only the person who was responsible for the international committee in Luxembourg came from New York. This was important for them. It was clear that it was first of all a German responsibility to deal with these pictures because they were also historically responsible for this. But nevertheless, it's important for them to underline that history is, from their point of view, too often used to sow discord between human beings. And especially they feared that there are hierarchies in the experience of suffering and the competition between victims. And this also leads not only to the competition about victims, but also to the confusion of historical phases. Maybe you have to know that, especially in Europe, after the end of the Cold War, after the fall down of the Iron Curtain, so especially many politicians, historians in the eastern parts said so that what happened during the Nazi regime and the crimes committed during the Stali area were equal. And that was a very huge discussion, and maybe this is the background of this sentence. The next important, So the next important sentence for them is it's important if especially or nations who are not like Germany, so we know quoting Celan, the murder is master of Germany, that also in the other nations you have to deal to see that you have bright and dark sides in your history, and you have to deal with both of the sides and not only say you are the victims of it, but also to think about how you were responsible and what you can learn from this. I think that's important, and nevertheless, this should lead, that's the hope of the survivors in their bequest, that young people, they deal with the Nazi ideology and with the Holocaust, that they try to raise a better world with peaceful intolerance, with anti-Semitism, fights against racism, xenophobia, and especially right-wing extremism. There's another paper, the next paper, it's not made by survivors, but by professionals from memorial museums. And now this Memorial Museums Charter also the starting point where people who work in memorial museums dealing with Nazi crimes in Germany, but it's a very general worldwide charter now, which was adopted on the one side by the IRA about 13 years ago, but also by the International Council of Museums. So, and there's a specific international committee, which also I was one of the founders 23 years ago, the International Committee for Memorial Museums for Victims of State Crimes, not only of Nazi crimes or the Holocaust, but of state crimes. If you would like to get more information, you can go here to the homepage Gedenkstättenforum.de, so it's a German homepage, but it says also an English page, and you can get an overview of all the memorial museums in Germany, but also worldwide. So the idea of this International Memorial Museums Charter was, first of all, the work of memorial museums is to protect the dignity of the victims and especially from all forms of exploitations. And what I believe is so the victims of the Nazi regime and not only of the Nazi regime, they were objects of history. And we have to be very careful not to do them once again as objects of history. Also, if we mean though it's our goodwill to do this, but nevertheless, we don't know if the victims really have the same political opinion, the same thoughts as we have. And in our educational work, also in the exhibitions which are doing, so the main point is to inspire critical and independent thinking about the task. Not to say you have to learn this and that from our history, but really to give them the facts, and they have the chance to decide what they can do with the facts. And then we have discussions with them. I think the encounter is one of the most important educational value in this field. So this International Memorial Museums Charter also said maybe that's the other side, for critical thinking should not be dictated by decree. But, and I think we have this since the 1980s in Germany, there should be a pluralistic culture of remembrance, because we have so many different groups who were persecuted. We have so many relatives of them, and they came from so many different angles and have so many different approaches to the same history. But we should acknowledge that they are different approach, and we should try to understand the others and should try to come to a common understanding of it, but not dictate what that our way to go to the history is about. Also, the questions quite often is we speak only about a negative history, and don't we have also positive values? And I think maybe we can, all of us who deal in this field can say, though, the and most important, but also sufficient positive values is the Universal Declaration of Human and Civil Rights. So we have not to go deeper into what's going on in this state and the other state. I think worldwide, if we agree that this is our positive value, that's quite good enough. So then I skipped something. The other question is, who is responsible if a memorial museum will be established? And from our point of view, it's very important that all the different groups who have an interest in this field should be involved in these discussions. And this should be an open and non-hierarchical pluralistic discussions with survivors, with scholars, with educators, with lobbyists, and also with committed social groups. So, for example, in Germany, one social group who is very much committed in this also, if they don't have survivors nowadays, is the groups of the so-called Sinti and Roma, who because many of them, we don't know exactly how much, but maybe 200, at least 200,000 were killed during the Nazi regime. But unfortunately, many of these people also after 1945 were discriminated. And that's one important reason why also this group and many other groups also should be involved in such discussions. Another thing is, as I've told you, that I had many talks with survivors, and sometimes mostly I was very impressed about this. But I had not only talks with survivors from the Holocaust, but from the Nazi regime, but also, let's say, though in Germany between 1945 and 1950, especially in East Germany, we had also internment camps for Germans. And they told me their stories too. And in this internment camps, also a third of the inmates died. So they had also bad living conditions. And if I listened only to these individual stories, I could not decide who had suffered more or less. And that's the reason why it's also necessary to understand the context, to understand the historical development. If you have this, then you can, at the end, you can decide, yeah, this was a totally way of persecution during the Nazi regimes and in occupied East Germany after 1945. And then I believe, on the one hand, for us, it's necessary to have this context and to deal with the context. On the other hand, we should be very careful not to minimize the personal suffering if we deal with this context. And also, as I said, so the survivors were very different, we are very different, so we have very multiple perspectives on this history, and also we have to consider this in our discussions. Also, especially for someone who comes from Germany, I think it's not enough only to speak about the victims. You can't understand the history if you speak only about the victims and what they had to go through. Also, you have to understand who was responsible for this. And in Germany, so during the West Germany during the 1980s, so we had a movement of many groups who started to erect small memorial museums, memorials, and they started to commemorate the victims. And they figured out that there were many groups of victims, but also they were neglected for 40 years in Germany. And then 8 years later, also the discussion started on who was responsible for these victims. And this discussion is for a society and for a state much more complicated as dealing with the victims. If you deal with the victims politically, morally, you're on the right side. But if you deal with your fathers, mostly our fathers, so from the age, it's much more difficult to do this. But I think that's a litmus test how memory and commemoration works in a society.
I think we're gonna need to sum up there.
That's my last picture. Also, if you deal with history, especially with this history, because it's also a very political history, it evokes risks. And so we should be very careful if we deal with this history with our visitors in memorial museums, but I think also in talks like here, not to overwhelm and not to indoctrinate people. And I think not forever we have subjects which are clear, and as long as they are controversial, they should be also treated as controversial. So I think in educational work, that's very important. And my last stop is that if you deal with history, also a self-critical approach to our history is very, very important. So that, as you've heard, I'm a staff member of the Topographie of Terror, which was in Germany from 87 on the first documentation center dealing with important persecution agencies, SS police, and the combination of the Reich Security Main Office for the Second World War. If you are interested in hearing more about the story, you have to ask me afterwards. Thank you very much for your patience.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you can hear me, I would like to thank Brandeis University and Karen. Karen, what can I say? I admire your tenacity, and you are a role model for me. We need people like you to not give up and continue your work. Thank you so much. Following on from Thomas Lutz, whose presentation was dedicated to Germany or more generally, I would now like to direct you towards Austria. I'm particularly touched that Jackie Levine, I hope, yes, is here today, a descendant of Max and Rosa Königsberg, a Viennese couple who were deported to the Jungfernhof camp and murdered in 1941. I am still in contact with Liesel Krag, granddaughter of Max and Rosa. She lives in Vienna, and her late son, Mickey, was a childhood friend of mine. I was a witness to his marriage. Liesel researched her family's history with all of its painful details and entrusted it to me to share a little bit of it today here with you. I'm aware also from my own family history of the power of transgenerational trauma, of the massive impact fates of our ancestors can have on our lives and also in the lives of our descendants. Commemorating the victims of the Holocaust has been a central pillar of my work for 28 years. My grandmother, Margit Lessing, was among those who was murdered in Auschwitz. So remembrance has also been a very personal topic for me. a constant motivation to my work in the National Fund. Auschwitz did not fall from the sky. Auschwitz crept in step by step, from small discriminatory regulations to mass genocide. These words were said by none other than Mariam Turski, Auschwitz survivor and president of the International Auschwitz Committee, whose vice president I have the honor to be. This realization is reflected in the fates of Max and Rosa Königsberg and all the Nazi victims. Pre-war Vienna, the grand imperial city of a bygone empire, was once home to around 200,000 Jews. Back then, the city had a rich and flourishing Jewish life, a world that no longer exists. After the so-called Anschluss during the Third Reich in Austria, more than 64,000 men, women, and children were murdered in the Shoah. Another 130,000 were expelled. They had to leave their homeland, their families and friends, their entire existences to live as refugees in a foreign land. Most never returned. By the time I grew up in Vienna, we were fewer than 10,000 Jews. In the years after the war, Austria viewed itself as Hitler's victim, first victim, and didn't make efforts to confront its past. Post-war society was more interested in rebuilding the country and looking to the future instead of reflecting on the past and taking responsibility. It is only during the last decades that Austria as a nation has really started to face up to its Nazi past and assume responsibility. One watershed moment, which marked the start of an important shift in Austria, was then Chancellor Franz Vranitzky's speech he delivered to the Austrian Parliament in July 1991. He said, he declared Austria's shared moral responsibility for its role in the machinery of oppression and persecution of the Third Reich. By taking this stance, he set in motion a long and difficult process of re-evaluation, and Thomas mentioned it. When you have to deal with the persecutors and with the perpetrators, this becomes very painful. One outcome of this was the establishment of the National Fund in 1995, which I have been the honor to build up. It was one of the first expressions of a new historical awareness. Established with the Austrian Parliament, the fund is a symbol that Austria is finally facing up to its responsibility in the name of all Austrians. Our first task was dedicated to the surviving victims, offering them recognition and support. They have thought that they had been totally ignored and their fate was not important. When I asked for the job, I asked my father, who fled Vienna in 1939 to go to exile in Palestine. I asked him, Papa, what would you like to hear from me as a civil servant, as an Austrian after 50 years, 45, 95, to amend or to say, sorry, what would you hear from me, want to hear from me? And my father wouldn't give me an answer. And I'm a nudnik, so I was pressing on him and asking again and nudging him and nudging him. Finally, my father, also typically Jewish, didn't answer, but he asked me two questions. One question was, can you give me back my childhood? Second was, can you bring back my mother from Auschwitz? Well, I couldn't. But with this knowledge, I went to the Speaker of the House, who is always the boss of the National Fund, and I said, it's too late, it's too little, but we will have to listen to their stories. And so we started listening. And we didn't only take care of the Jewish survivors, but also Roma and Sinti, people persecuted on political grounds, physically or mentally disabled, homosexuals, and any other ground for persecution. To date, we have provided material help to 30,000 people around the world. And I have visited countries till Uruguay and Argentina, and I found many survivors there. And behind every payment stands a person who has suffered. We remain aware no payment, regardless of the amount, can ever compensate for the immeasurable pain which was bestowed on them. Keeping the memory alive is our mission. The lives of the dead lie in the memories of the living, Cicero said. In the past 28 years, the National Fund has been involved in many projects, striving to create a connection between the past, the present, and the future. And so, as survivors entrusted us with their stories, we have put on our website, but also in book form, life stories, knowing that each memoir is a unique part of Austrian history. It's a small world by itself. Since today in this panel, we are dealing with forgotten victims and with forgotten killing sites, I would like to highlight some projects in which forgetting and late remembering were the focus. Besides Auschwitz, too many names of other, no less terrible places pale into insignificance. Many in the Baltic states, like Paneriai, Rumbola, Birkeniki forests. Names like Malitrostinets in Belarus, where more than 10,000 Austrians of Jewish origin met a cruel end, were long forgotten. The limits of my language are the limits of my world, said Wittgenstein. That for which we have no words slips from our consciousness and is no longer part of our reality. As the names of the concentration camps and extermination sites fade, so do the memories of the countless victims and the awareness of the vast dimensions of the genocide. The National Fund has funded a project to safeguard the name, for example, of that place of extermination, Malitrostinets, including annual memorial trips to Malitrostinets, and in 2018, and believe me, in Belarus, it was not easy, the National Fund funded the construction of a memorial, the Massive of Names by Daniel Samberg, commemorating 10,000 Austrians of Jewish origin who were deported from Vienna to Minsk in 1942 and murdered there. When we talk about the Jungfernhof camp today, the situation is very similar. The victims were taken to places far away from their homeland, to places whose name are hardly known, lost places in history for decades. And just as the places are forgotten, so were the victims and their lives. But these victims must also find their place in the collective memory and be invited to return home, so to say. In this belief, we have also supported a survivor from Canada in his quest to create a new memorial in Vienna. With the Shoah Wall of Names Memorial, Remembrance of Jewish life in Austria has received a new focal point in the heart of Vienna, a central yet quiet place to commemorate the fate of the Jewish children, women and men of Austria, and to pay tribute to their lives. The more than 64,000 names engraved on 160 granite slabs are erected to form an oval, which makes an impressive sight. It has become a place of encounter for the families of the victims. The Shoah Wall is a place to remember and commune with their murdered loved ones. For all people in Austria and visitors, it is a place where they can encounter history and remember the murdered. For me personally, it is a special experience to go to the memorial and run my fingers over my grandmother's name, Margit Lessing, my great-grandmother name, Mali Schwarz, and my great-aunt, Carola Goland-Lecker. May their memory be blessed. It means I can feel them, who have no grave, who have no tombstone. For me, that is a special magic of this place, which I certainly share with other descendants. In remembering the victims and their fates, we also spread knowledge about the Holocaust and encourage learning from history today. Unfortunately, This is more than necessary today, not only in Austria, but worldwide. Anti-Semitism is well and truly back on the radar, and not just in Austria. Especially in the wake of the atrocities of October 7th last year. Anti-Semitism is showing its ugly face again, brazenly and without shame. We owe it to the victims and their families to remember and to fight anti-Semitism. Liesl Krag has come to a wonderful conclusion about remembering, and I quote from her letter. She said, "I have somehow brought my ancestors to life and I'm passing my knowledge on to my offspring. I was once asked what my life is for, and I answered spontaneously, die goldene Kite, the golden chain in Yiddish, from the dawn of time to the end of time. I am part of that and it makes good sense to me." End of quote. For me, this is what ethics of memorialization means. Remembrance is the expression of an inner belief that acknowledges our duty not to forget. This duty is universal and applies not only to the past, but also to the future. As the Baal Shem Tov said, forgetfulness prolongs the exile. Remembrance is the secret of redemption. Thank you.
Like to thank Karen for putting together this beautiful event, and we're acquainted with Karen now for probably 14 years. And our cooperation has its ups and downs, as any cooperation. I think anybody in the audience who's worked in a project involving more than 2 people knows that. But I think it's a great result we have already achieved. I also would like to thank my dear colleagues from International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance who are now on the panel. I mean, that's one of many structures that brought us together. Hannah and Thomas for giving a great introduction to what I will say. Because Latvia's experience with Holocaust commemoration is very different from Western European experience, and of course, from American experience. And it partially explains where we are now with commemorating the victims of Jungfernhof camp. So one important thing that before being occupied by the Nazis, in 1940, Latvia was occupied by the Soviet Union as a result of Soviet-Nazi pact or Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, which gave Baltic countries and parts of Poland to the Soviet Union. And so during the first year of Soviet occupation, more than 15,000 people were arrested, deported to Siberia, where many of them perished or were executed, and among them about 1,800 Jews, people from the industry, from liberal professions, politicians, prominent intellectuals, so about 2% of Latvian Jew population. And so this major deportation happened just a week before Nazis invaded. On June 14th, Soviets deported people, and on June 22nd, Nazis invaded 1941. And Nazis extensively would blame Jews on the Soviet atrocities. They would speak of Jewish Bolshevism. And of course, this was one of the ways to recruit the local collaborators to do the dirty work. But we have to remember that the local collaborators were collaborators with somebody. That's collaborators willing. It's a very complicated thing to explain. We describe it as a Holocaust on offer. Nazis come and say, well, we have plans to isolate the Jews, evacuate the Jews. They use all kind of euphemisms. who is joining us. And there are people who are joining. So the same as I would ask you if you would like coffee, and some of you say, yeah, fine, here's my coffee. It's very strange. And this is very important why we generally teach about the Holocaust, because Holocaust tells us a lot about human psychology. That's the universal importance of speaking about the Holocaust. Not that only it's a huge tragedy, individual set of individual tragedies and collective tragedy, but it also tells us a lot about human psychology, how societies act in critical situations, how individuals respond to challenges. And that's why it is not less important discussing it in 2024 than it was 20 years or 50 years ago. And of course, it explains us a lot about other crimes that have been committed later and are being committed today. Yes, unfortunately, we're discussing today on the background of October 7th events, on the background of Russia's war against Ukraine. So we do not live in a, unfortunately, in the world better than So when the Second World War ends, Latvia is reoccupied by the Soviets. Survivors return or go or appear from hidings. Some people who survived Gulag, they return from Siberia. Some people who managed to escape and spend more years as refugees in Russia or soldiers in Soviet army, they also return. That's, for example, the story of survival of members of my family. For Soviets, most important thing concerning the victims of Second World War is to collect evidences for what we now know as Nuremberg trials. So they try to locate the graves, they try to find out the number of victims, but they also evaluate how many factories were destroyed, arable land made unusable. So it's all very much about reparations. Reparations in a very material sense, the money or physical objects that can be moved from occupied territories of Germany and its allies to the Soviet Union. So victims of Holocaust are in a certain way instruments of politics in this sense. There are investigative commissions that work and they produce extensive amount of documentation which we still use today. For the relatives of the survivors, first and foremost, it's important to preserve the dignity of the victims. For them, the dignity of the victims, especially if we speak of Jewish victims, is burying them properly. So in many, many cases, the survivors or the relatives of victims, they would come to these killing sites and they would reinter the remains from these places to Jewish cemeteries. There is a huge discussion now, and today many Jewish religious authorities would insist on not touching the Holocaust grave because it would be desecrated. For these people, it's very clear that leaving victims where they were killed in these forests, swamps, on roadsides is much bigger humiliation than opening their grave and burying them in the cemetery. It would be a much bigger challenge to the Jewish religious law. So it's very important that quite often something that we may perceive today as a desecration was actually perceived as a proper way of acting. Yeah, and if today perspective would be that opening a grave is unethical, back then it was just the opposite. So many, many victims were reinterred. In some cases, the monuments were installed in their graves in the cemeteries. Sometimes the monuments, temporary signs, were installed also in the places where people were killed. And what's important, most Latvian Jews were not deported anywhere. So they were killed in the very first month of Nazi occupation between July and December 1941, we're speaking of approximately 68,000 people who were killed in these few months in the places where they lived. More than 230 Holocaust-related sites we have identified in Latvia. So this is the second very important aspect. The neighbors knew what happened to the Jews. If in Germany or Austria, people could say, well, the Jews were sent somewhere, they were evacuated to the east, to the imaginary east, Eastern Europe, and we don't know what happens to them. Maybe they were sent to Palestine and they're growing oranges there. In Latvia, everybody knows where are their Jewish neighbors. And so for many people, it was kind of a suppressed memory, because if at the very initial moments, the Soviets tried to, as we could say, instrumentalize this Holocaust memory, then in 1949, 1950 comes a big anti-Jewish campaign in the Soviet Union, and all of official commemoration stops. We're not speaking anymore about Jewish victims of Nazis. When in 1958, a group of people from Riga Jewish congregation addressed the authorities saying that we have collected several boxes of human remains in Bitternik forest in Riga, and it was also the place where prisoners from Jungfernhof were murdered. The authority, and we wanted to bury them, but we also were asked by Yad Vashem Memorial in Jerusalem to send them some ashes to be buried in this valley of communities they were establishing. So what the Soviet authorities announced that, first of all, maybe not all victims were religious, so why does religious community deal with the reinterment of the remains? And second, these victims were first and foremost Soviet citizens. And so it can only Soviet state be one dealing with their remains. And so this term, Soviet civilians, Soviet citizens, sometimes even Soviet patriots, would be the one that would be placed on the memorials that were installed by the official institutions. Soviet Union had huge problems dealing with the issue of civilian victims in general, because you could not call them really martyrs for some ideology, as there were, for example, members of resistance movement, communists or others, or artisans, or even Soviet army soldiers. It was very clear how to deal, how to praise these people who were fallen for something, while civilian victims, like Holocaust victims, or patients of mental hospitals, or Roma people, they have not fallen in struggle. They were just murdered. And Soviet ideology could not handle this. It was for them unclear how this can be used. So basically in the 50s and 60s, there was a big wave of installing memorials where they tried to praise these people, not mentioning that they were victims of racial crimes. And this wave of commemoration comes because Soviet Union celebrates two anniversaries in Latvia. It's not universal. So if you would be discussing, for example, Ukraine or Belarus, there would be different specifics. But in Latvia, there is 1958, when the Soviets celebrate 40 years since Soviet rule was established in Latvia. And 1960, they celebrate 20 years since Soviet rule was reestablished in Latvia. So Latvia was occupied by the Soviet Union. And they have a big program of installing all kinds of monuments for that, for these anniversaries, among them monuments on the sites of Nazi crimes. And the biggest monument they've installed as a part of this program is a huge memorial ensemble on the site of the Salaspils camp near Riga, which is also connected to the story of Jungfernhof, which is extremely impressive piece of Soviet memorial art, mostly telling the story of resistance, not being subjected, and they mentioned with one word, literal, there was one word, Jews, listing all the kind of groups of prisoners who were there, including some of the groups who never were there, like French or Croatians. So all through the Soviet, late Soviet period, there is kind of dichotomy. Soviet regime cannot say that we do not commemorate Nazi victims, but any attempts to commemorate Nazi victims for who they really were is problematic, it's challenging. And so some important initiatives, they're grassroots. For example, Anna mentioned the memorial in Rumbula forest near Riga, the place where prisoners of Riga Ghetto were murdered. And it's also the place where the sister of my grandmother was killed. So there, in the early 60s, there are groups of young people, really aged 18, 20, who just every Sunday would go landscaping, trying to locate the graves based on archival evidences and to install at least something. The Soviets usually either sent the police school cadets to disperse them, or at least to surveil them. Then in 1964, the authorities would allow the monument to be installed, but only with the inscription that they approve of. And they, for a few years, tried to hijack the event by bringing their official speakers who would discuss the war in Vietnam and say, literally, you have these speeches published in newspapers, and then 1967, when there's a 6-day war and Soviet Union severe diplomatic ties with Israel, once again, they started dispersing these gatherings up to late 1980s. People would not be arrested for that. So they would not be permitted to organize that. And so only in 1988, when the communist rule was already crumbling, we could say once again you could have legal, visible ceremonies. And also in 1988, you have the first commemorative event in the center of Riga, the site where once the Great Synagogue stood, which was burned on July 4th with some people inside. In the Soviet times, there was a park on that place. And then in this park gathered Holocaust survivors, people from the Jewish community, and they committed to building a memorial there. So there is installed a small sign saying that here will be a memorial to the victims of Nazis, which really is unveiled in 1992. And in Rumbula Forest, finally, they, in 2002, also with the help from the National Fund, installed the memorial, which have clearly Jewish symbols in it. They have menorah, Star of David, and also they installed memorials in Bitterneke Forest, also with German and Austrian funding mostly, which was the place where were killed Riga Jews, Jews from Western Europe, but also patients of mental hospitals, also Soviet POWs, and there are huge discussions how to make this memorial relevant for all these groups without making it, pulling the blanket to the side of one of the groups. So the symbols chosen is kind of symbolic altar and symbolic canopy and different symbols of different groups.
I'm going to have to.
Yeah,
Okay.
1 minute.
Great.
One very
Sorry.
important thing. No, I've already got to the 90s. So
Okay.
one very important thing that since Latvia regained independence in 1990, the discussions could happen freely. But there were also a lot of discussions about the issue of collaboration. And there were also a lot of discussions about if Holocaust fits into Latvia's history. If Holocaust has a place as part of Latvia's history, or it's Jewish history, which happened in Latvia. It may seem strange, but in 1990s, this was very clear discussion. Many people would say, yes, Latvia, Holocaust happened in Latvia. Some Latvians participated, mostly Germans did that, Latvians participated. That's not part of our history. Latvian history and Jewish history are two separate entities. Yeah, nobody would say anything like that today anymore. That is very important progress. And second very important progress, it's turned out that before the state activists started participating in Holocaust commemoration, there were a lot of these memory activists, as we could call them. The same process that happened in Germany in the 80s. So these would be local school teachers, museum workers, librarians who want to commemorate their Jewish neighbors or Jewish neighbors of their fathers and grandfathers. So when in 1998, State Commission of Historians was created to research Latvia's history under occupation, there was already an amount of research done and amount of activism. And this commission started working on Holocaust commemoration because of one simple reason. Now we can speak of that openly. Right? Latvia wanted to join EU, NATO. And it was unofficially convened that EU and NATO are not only economic or military organizations, but also organizations of countries sharing the same values. And coming to terms with the Holocaust is part of common values. Because we want to know that we are defending really like-minded nations, if not people. So this was very important, that there was this outer stimulus. But outer stimulus couldn't do anything if there were not people inside who want to research and wants to commemorate. So there was sort of synergy. And today we can say, I would a bit disagree with Karen. So I would see that money still is the problem, as with any memorial any project. But there is very clear understanding that Holocaust memory is important. And that's why Karen's work is so prominent, because people are now used to memory activism. And people are responsive to memory activism, different from how it was maybe 30 years ago. So this is something that makes me very optimistic that we'll manage to get the memorial. We can have, and we will have, a lot of discussions what the memorial will be, but we will have it. Thank you.
That's okay. Well, that was a good way to end with the will be a memorial. What we're going to do now is I'd have us talk amongst ourselves for a little bit, and then we'll open it up to questions. So if you have questions, be thinking about it, but we're going to do a little conversation among ourselves before we get to that. And I hope, some of you will react to what the others have said, and I might have some questions too. So who would like to start here?
I can start by, yes, we are so long-time colleagues that we have discussed all what we talked about for ages. So to wrap it up, I think it will be impossible. But what maybe I can reflect, yes, I've been to Latvia, and I think that we really need to see of all those endangered sites. As being colleagues in the IRA, there is a safeguarding site guidelines, a charter, which just has been adopted during the presidency of the Croatian government, leading the IRA for a year. And this is exactly what we need for such endangered sites, to have guidelines. How do we deal with these places? It's also very interesting what Ilya said about the religiosity. Many people who were buried there were not religious. Still, we need to take care of the religious rules. I am responsible in Austria also for the renovation of Jewish cemeteries. By Jewish law, you are not allowed to touch the body and to move them. But I totally understand that for the descendants, for the survivors, it was humiliating to know that the body of your grandfather is somewhere in a muddy water and you want to retrieve it. So these are the things that all you have to think about it before you're going into such endangered sites. But again, I think that the IRA has really made a very important step by giving out such guidelines, because yes, we are in the year 2024, but yes, there are still places out there, mass graves and places where bodies are, and we have to take care of them.
On the one hand, I could say so many things. On the other hand, I don't know what's most important. Maybe you spoke about the grave. So I also can see how during the last 7, 8 decades things have changed. So also in Germany in the 60s, Jewish communities sold cemeteries. And nowadays, so it's unbelievable to do such a thing, but it was a totally different time, though there were only a few people left. They don't have money. People would like to build things there. And so that's the one thing. That the other thing is what's very important is, and I think that's we have an easier task to do in Germany as in Latvia and other places, is that if you have a memorial, you need someone who also maintain it, who did care of it. So I know memorials in other encounters in other places who were made there, and I was there 5 years later, and it were rubble places. And so you have to think about how you can also initiate that also the people living around there and the scientists in the university nearby, and also they also feel that's our project. And it has something to do with us, and it's not coming from far away. And after they have invent money, but then they were back. I think that's a very crucial question, especially in countries you have spoken about.
And concerning that, I can say that one of the main challenges is not only finding somebody who would be responsible for it, but also that it keeps up to its responsibility. Because, for example, one of the issues we have with Jungfernhof is administrative reforms in Riga municipality. Every year when we apply for the permission to conduct research there or organize an event, I'm applying to new institution because something has changed in the municipality. They've reorganized departments and sections. And once again, there is some person who is for the first time hearing about Jungfernhof and this place in general, and who does not understand what's happening. I mean, these people are very friendly and nice, and they put no obstacles, but this is also the problem that institutions who take care or have to take care of the killing sites, they have usually tons of other responsibilities. So that's why, unfortunately, most effective is then where there's a special association which is dedicated to preserve this place. And that continues all the time, keeping it on the radar. Yeah, because otherwise we can end up that just the memorial is in the responsibility of somebody who really doesn't care about it, not because he's bad or Holocaust denier, but just for him, it's task number 227 between, I don't know, mowing the grass, running a kindergarten and something else.
Just a quick, we are really in Austria in this wonderful situation to have the National Fund because we are state funded. We had received up to 800 million euros until now, which we paid out in compensation, but which we use also for exactly this, keeping the memorial sites up and trying to not and renovate them if it needed. But what we also realized, we are distributing something called the Simon Wiesenthal Prize for the last 3 years, where we are giving awards to civil society projects, because in the little villages in Austria, we have found wonderful civil society taking care of memorials, taking care of mowing the lawn in the Jewish cemeteries, etc. And we need the civil society to make it then go into the collective memory. That's very important.
Although I think that brings up the broader question of responsibility and where the responsibility should lie. And I understand that that's probably a much more complicated question in a place like Latvia that, as you explained so well, where there's occupiers and multiple victims and multiple perpetrators. But I'm wondering, you know, how each of you think about, either specifically in Latvia or more generally in the countries that were occupied. I mean, is this, and how much is this being put on maybe what's ever left of the Jewish community there? Or is that, I mean, is that where the kind of activism and memory is coming from? And if so, is that fair?
Maybe just quick, I mean, no, the Jewish community in Austria is very small, so we wouldn't be able to take care of our cemeteries. 8,000 people today cannot pay into the Chevrat Kadisha to take care of 200,000 or more tombstones. So yes, it is Austria, on one hand, the state responsible, and since 1991, it was clear that Austria took the responsibility, but also the Jewish community is activating civil society, who are all non-Jewish. And I think this is the combination which works best, but we are really in a lucky position in Austria.
Yeah, for me, I have to say this is not a Jewish question, this is a German question. And so we should know, so why should only the Jews deal with this issue? So it's an issue really of the state, of the society, of the universities, of the Wehrmacht, of many other institutions who were involved, and they have to deal with this issue. That's the first thing. The other thing is, if you go to Germany, every politicians will not deny that there was the Holocaust, and they all use speaking in memorial museums to have a very high moral standard. I'm not sure if they could have the standards in their normal life and normal politics. And I've heard also yesterday evening so that Germany is a master in dealing with this. So if I'm very critical, I say, so first we were the master to kill the people, and now we were the master to commemorate the people. But what strikes me very much is that especially for the German foreign policy, dealing with this issue was very cheap compared to bankruptcy of a bank or other things, but it helped Germany to get a very good acknowledgement in the world. And if you see this and really how difficult is also, we are state funded, we got more funds compared to 30 years ago, and so on and so on. But nevertheless, I have the feeling so it becomes more and more something which is empty if you go to the content of these things. And though it's a process, I don't know how will the process continue in the next 10 or 20 years. But it strikes me very much that on the one hand, everyone is committed to this, but if you then ask what this really means in the actual work, in going to the parliament, in supporting memorial museums, then there is an important difference, which I do not like so much.
Concerning on whom lays the obligation or the responsibility for the memorials, I would say that on those who are ready to take the responsibility. It's important that, unfortunately, well, memory is a mechanism, as we understand. And when we say collective memory, it's not like each member of the collective remembers the same. It's the sort of convention between the people. It's a decision that something is important for us, something is not important. And so you cannot enforce it. Yeah, you can work with memory, but you cannot enforce the responsibility. I guess anybody who tried making a teenage kid to make up his bed and to clean up a room knows that things cannot be, many things cannot be enforced. And unfortunately, states quite often are rebellious teenagers where they better not be. But I think in this sense, it's very important that, for example, in Latvia, what's very different from Austria and Germany. So as we had these two occupations, and before the Nazi occupation was Soviet occupation, which destroyed the institutions of Latvian state. The state says we do not have kind of political responsibility for the Holocaust. The responsibility is individual because no institutions of Latvian state were used. And that's true. Yeah, so Nazis saw Latvians as inferiors, not as inferiors as, for example, Poles, but still inferior. So they did not use the structures of Latvian state. They say there is no political direct responsibility on us as on institutions, as for example, German railways took the responsibility. But they say that it's part of our history. That's why I emphasized. Now people see it as part of our history, and that's why I think that very effective is working with municipalities, because after all, we're discussing the residents of the same town, yeah, who lived there and who were not less part of the landscape as their neighbors of other religions or other ethnic backgrounds. And municipalities quite often would be responsive. So I think it's most effective to work with those people who are ready in one way or another to take this responsibility. Yes, it may sound that you're going the easiest way, the weakest way. It's maybe morally not the strongest position, but if you want to see the work done in your lifetime, you better, I would say that we move in this direction. And then maybe at some point comes also the responsibility on higher levels.
I had one more question that I wanted to ask, and then we will open it up to questions. And so hopefully keep your answer short because, yeah. But in all of your talks, you mentioned the importance of protecting the dignity of victims from exploitation. But I'm wondering where victimization, where exploitation begins and memorialization continues. I mean, it seems as if there is at least the possibility, and I guess I feel this most keenly as a journalist, where in order to effectively document what has happened, you sometimes have to intrude into what has happened to the victims. And of course, in this particular situation, there's not even the possibility of consent, right? So you have to, as a journalist or a historian or a memorialization, you have to make that decision yourself. And so I'm wondering where you see the line between exploitation and memorialization occurs.
I think I have just a very quick answer to that, and maybe it's not in the direction of what you ask, but for me, the exploitation is when you use the survivors and the victims to commemorate in Parliament every year the same, and to, oh, the poor victims and the poor survivors. It's like commemorating the dead Jew. A dead Jew is always better than a living Jew. And that's for me the kind of line which is so difficult to keep, that, oh yeah, we commemorate 27th of January and we commemorate Mauthausen. But when it comes to the fight against anti-Semitism and commemorating the living Jews, that's the problem. And for me, this is the golden line.
Yeah, that's not, I can't give an easy answer and maybe not a correct answer to this, but what we try to do in our job is to explain what happened and to tell the stories. And then the people should think what they can do with the stories. And they were from very multiple angles, depending on the circumstances, on the specific groups they were persecuted, on many other things. That's the one thing. And for me, the exploitation starts if someone uses this history for its own purposes. That's important. That's the crucial thing. And so we should be very careful to do this by our own. Maybe also there is a risk that we do it in our institutions, no doubt about it. But nevertheless, I can see it more and more often, especially on the field on politicians. And that strikes me.
Well, I think I totally agree with what the colleague said. And I think it's important that you treat the victims actually in the same way as you would treat if they were alive. And we're happy still to have survivors. So why should we treat the victims the other way than we treat survivors? Nobody was born a victim, after all. Yeah. On the other hand, I'm sorry to say, but those who are survivors, they were doomed to become victims. So we just know that the Nazis did not manage, thanks God, to do that. So that's very simple. If you're instrumentalizing the living ones, you inevitably will instrumentalize the dead ones, and the opposite. So that's why we should support those who try to oppose this instrumentalization. Yeah, and even in educational purposes, if you're unable to tell why Holocaust or Nazi crimes or crimes against humanity are bad without showing the pile of corpses, then it's something wrong with your approach, not with your audience. Yeah, so if you think that people are that stupid that only seeing photos of naked women being chased to the pit is the only way to explain why killing people is bad and why you should not commit mass crimes, it's something wrong with you and your society.
Thank you very much. We'll now open it up to questions, but we're going to start with Dr. Michael Hayden, who's coming to us via Zoom or whatever program we're using from Vancouver.
Well, good morning, everyone. Let me just start off by saying to Karen, what an inspiration you are for having created a new family. And these are a family of descendants of survivors. I'm so sorry I can't be there in person, but I feel the bond and look forward to exploring that as we go forward. My grandparents were shipped from Hamburg to Riga in early December 1941. And I personally started off in Hamburg, and in Hamburg I was able, as our dear friend from Vienna expressed, touch the names of my grandparents, Max and Gertrude Hahn, on the wall there, very moving. And then was able to go to Riga, visited both Jungfernhof as well as the forest. We still don't know where our grandparents were killed, but I was shocked at the railway station, firstly, to see a commemoration to the heroes of Latvia who had fought the Russian occupation. And then when I went to the camp, I was really seeing people playing. It became a recreation park, and also went to the Jewish Museum in Riga. But I'm left troubled today because I saw then no real movement towards a memorial in Latvia, in this particular concentration camp where probably my grandparents' bodies are. And even today, from Ilya, I don't see any real moves towards a memorial. My question is to Ilya. My question is, what are the practical moves? You talk about a memorial being established. I'd love to know by when, by whom, and when can we visit the memorial in Latvia and Riga, where this camp now has a memorial to which we can pay our respects and commemorate the lives of our beloved grandparents. Most of us, it's grandparents. I'd like to know more practical details from Ilya about what's happening and when it will be available.
There are two parts to my answer. One, I would be also glad to know when it will be available. So I would just want to correct one small thing. At Stuttgart, a railway station where the trains arrive, there is not a memorial praising Latvian heroes. It's a memorial for victims of Soviet repressions who died in Gulag. Yeah, so, and this is one of the reasons why we have not yet installed, for example, which we had plans, a memorial, some sort of memorial sign at the railway station, because then inevitably there would be what was discussed, comparison of victimhood, which we want to avoid. Yeah, and so we most probably now the German embassy is working on installing their kind of memorial plaque or something like that. Yeah, because after all, this railway station is not so much a place of death, but a place of suffering. So concerning the practical things, it's very easy. So thanks to Karen's efforts, for 3 years now, there is geospatial research, geophysical research. We're looking for the mass grave because we want, if we're installing memorial, to install it in order also to protect the mass grave from further development. And then the area will be replanned, rezoned, so to say. If we do not find the grave, then we'll have to opt for some, I can say, random place for memorial. Well, random in the sense that it will be our choice in our negotiations with the municipality. Yeah, but not connected to exactly what happened at this very square inch. When it happens, nobody knows. There is small thing called MONEY, which we would be glad if people would contribute to this project. Asking questions is good. Also, doing something is not worse, trust me. So we hope next year to organize a groundbreaking ceremony, which would be more symbolic, but which would clearly establish our presence there. Yeah, so I don't know, we hope this year to install sort of information plaque there, because currently there is an information plaque which tells the history of the area from 17th century when it was a manor. It also mentions the camp and the imprisonment of Jews from Germany and Austria. It's one sentence. So we want to install there a more extensive description of the history of the camp. Also that locals get used to this being not a simply recreational area. What's important, when Karen first got involved in this project in 2007, then 2010, it was not a recreation area, it was a dump. Literally, in a very exact meaning of the word. There was a place where people dumped old car tires, all kind of rubbish and so on. So it moved from a totally improper to discussable. Let's put it like that. So, but we hope that few years probably the memorial will be there. It also depends what sort of memorial is there, and then there are different projects Karen developed in the course of time, but she obviously is more in position to discuss these. So this is completely different story, but these are the practical steps. If somebody wants to join the effort, we would be glad.
May I have a follow-up question, Ilya? Thank you so much for some of that information. What I've also noted and what I've learned is Latvians certainly played a key role in the execution and the killing of Jews during this period. These were Latvian citizens, not just Germans. And I'm wondering if you give us some insights about Latvian taking direct responsibility for their participation in the murder of Jews in Riga at different places, but in particular at Jungfernhof and also in the forest in 1942. Could you give us some indication of is there an increasing responsibility being taken by Latvian citizens?
I think I've already mentioned a little bit of these discussions. So in 1990, September 19th, 1990, 3 months after Latvia proclaimed reestablishing its independence, there was a special declaration passed by Latvian parliament, which was basically still under Soviet occupation, which was called Declaration on Condemnation of Anti-Semitism and Genocide, if I remember the name correctly, where it explicitly spoke about Latvian involvement and how it is unacceptable and how we have to address this issue. And since then, basically, each and every Latvian president, which has more ceremonial and moral role, would discuss these issues in different ways. Not all presidents were on the same level of intellectual profoundness, were interested in discussing these issues. But definitely this question is addressed. As I said, Latvia clearly states that it has no direct political responsibility because Latvia did not physically exist during the Nazi occupation. It existed legally, but did not exist physically and could not do anything nor to protect, not to harm its citizens, but their responsibility lays with individuals, and there is moral responsibility and the state takes it. Yeah, and this was, for example, one of the driving forces behind finally in 2022 was passed a law which settled the issues of restitution of Jewish property and which reimbursed certain sum for the property which was not returned in the 90s. But I would not go now into telling the story in much detail. I was part of the working group since 2011. Some of gray hair on my head are because of that, I guess. So it was a work. It's another story. Yeah. So that's the moral responsibility. Can we say that it's on the level some other countries? Maybe not. But most important, I think, is the progress.
Thank you.
Open it up for questions. I think the thing to do is just raise your hand and there's someone with a mic.
Hi, I'm the assistant manager of this. There are 2 student employees in the back. They raise your hand. They are back there. Everybody wave at our 2 lovely student employees. So if you need a mic and you cannot walk to that mic there in the middle, please raise your hand. They will keep track of you and they will deliver the mic to you.
It's terrific.
So if you can go up to the mic if you're capable of doing that. And Shula is.
Thank you for this very intelligent and honest panel. I have a simple question. The latest I learned is that there were 40,000 concentration camps in Europe. Does anyone have a different number than that? 44,000. Okay, this is not I don't want to debate that. I just, if you said there's 150,000, then I would be way off. But this is 10% off, it's all right. So my question is actually to Thomas Lutz, which is, of those 40,000, 44,000 known concentration camps, how many have a memorialization? And how much work is there left to be done? And does everyone, no, I really want to know.
Yeah, no,
And where, and who's responsible? Is there something going to be done? And what do you think about this problem that this camp that Karen has helped us understand is one of many, 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 and not every camp has a Karen behind it.
I hesitate to use such numbers because so the USHMM had a number of 44,000 camps, but what does it mean? So you have totally different camps. So if you go to the extermination camps, you have only 5 or 6 of them. They have a totally different history, a totally different importance, as most of the camps were forced labor camps. So the possibility to survive there was totally different as to these camps. And also if you go to concentration camps, there was an old counting there in the German Reich where 1,600 concentration and satellite camps. Also these camps were quite different. So it's the satellite camps, but often were only for a few months at the end of the Second World War. It depends very much on the people who were responsible for the camps, how people could survive or die during this few months there. So that's the reason why I hesitate to use such numbers. And you can't say 44,000 concentration camps, that's incorrect. The other thing is that I believe that such historical sites are very important for a continuation of the dealing with its history and of the commemoration of the people, especially if we don't have a biographical connection to the site. What will be the hook if you would like to start to deal with people doing this? And if you have a stone or if you have a plaque in your city, in your village, then at least they have a chance to start the discussion. Maybe that's not enough. If you have a small institution or if you have a larger institution which provides educational work, which has research and can do exhibitions, that's much better at this. So, but nevertheless, that's important. And also I can't tell you the number of the stones in Germany. So maybe you know this Stumble Stones project. I think nowadays there are 120,000 or more than 120,000 stumble stones, not only in Germany, but all over Europe. There was a book written 30 years or 20 to 30 years ago in Germany, 2 volumes. Each volume has 800 pages, where at that period of time, all the plaques and stones were listed. And that's 20 years ago or more than 20 years ago. And now we have more and more of this. So the important and the nice thing, as we have in many cities, in many villages, you have either offices like archives, like others who start to deal with this issue, or you have civil action groups who are doing this. And I think to have this cultural surrounding who is interested in this, I think that's very important. It's not only a question of the states that they are doing something, it's very important that it's also a cultural interest. And up to now, I would say also we have a change of generations, also in the young generations has an interest in this field. No doubt about it. The question is if they can do it because of different living conditions to us, if they can continue to this. I have worked in many memorial museums, and I would say if people go also to the Topographie of Terror, which was not a camp where people died, but all the or most of the plans were made there for people who were persecuted all over Europe. Also, if people discuss things there, they discuss the things in another way as if they discuss the same questions 2 kilometers away. I think that's the reason why these historical sites are so important. And that's, I'm sure the same is in Jungfernhof, the same is in Vienna and other things. I think so. So these sites are very important, and they will become more important in the future.
Can I just add, if you go on our website, again, Austria is really lucky, it seems, because we have a geodata application where you can look up all the memorials, all the Stolpersteine, anything which has been done in Austria. So you can find this on the internet, and it's Google Map and even Google World, so you can see this.
I can say that in Latvia and Lithuania, these are not camps, but I think this count of 40,000 actually includes not only camps, but also the killing sites. Yeah, in Eastern European countries, which are forests, basically. So Latvia and Lithuania have websites, Holocaust Atlas of Lithuania and memorialplaces.lu.lv, which also list all the sites. And there you can read and see photos if there is marker, if there is no marker, but at least the site itself is listed. And it includes even the places where you do not know the exact location, but at least you register that in this forest, there was a killing.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but we'll do one more question. Sorry. And I do apologize for that. I know other people might have had questions, but the panelists were very interesting talking to, so.
Is this on? Yeah. Hi, I'm Lisa Gruenberg. I'm a physician and writer and researcher into medicine and the Holocaust. I have 2 questions. And one I think I will take from Dr. Lessing offline. You mentioned the stumbling stones, and when I visited Vienna to research my first book, there were very few memorials to Jews in Vienna. I'm glad that's changing. I was contacted several years ago by a group in Chemetz because some of our relatives were there, murdered there, and about creating stumbling stones. They were researching these relatives. My cousin and I contacted groups in Vienna about getting stumbling stones for my aunt, my father's sister, my grandparents who were deported on May 27th, 1942 to Melitrostanek and murdered, either shot or walked or jumped into a mass grave, maybe buried alive. I was told we could do it. We had to pay for the stones. We had to pay for research into what happened to them, even though we had done the research ourselves. And we would have to pay if we wanted a ceremony for them. So I'm just putting that out there. That was just a few
I
years ago.
think you need to ask a question. I'm sorry, but we're.
Okay,
running
so
out
the
of time.
question is from the panel, Dr. Lutz, you mentioned the hierarchy of suffering, which I think is true for survivors, also true for descendants of survivors. There's a lot of competition for sorrow currently with Ukraine, with the war in the Middle East. And I'm just wondering how all of you are dealing with that comparison, competition, the hierarchy of suffering.
That's a great question.
Thank you.
Do you want to start?
I can. Yeah, that's a question for the next half an hour, day. First of all, I think we as Germans, we have to commemorate everyone. That's the one thing. It's not depending if he or she was a communist or homosexual or because the Nazis made them to choose what else. That's the one thing. The other thing is in our historical work, we have to explain that there were different groups and they were treated differently because of the ideology of the Nazis, because of the development of the Nazi regime in the concentration camp and so on. So we have to make this differentiation. I think that's important. The other things, so we have tried as we started this work in West Germany during the 80s, we tried to bring all the different groups together, that they also be acknowledged from this German society and get restitution all together, and that maybe a homosexual could give the hand to a communist, and the communist says, yeah, you're also a victim of the Nazi regime, which was not such an easy task to bring these two people together. And nowadays, unfortunately, in our world, we have more and more the situation that the groups are looking more to themselves and would not do something with others. I think that's a pity situation. The Memorial Museums try to work against it, but these groups, unfortunately, it's very general. Maybe that's also some don't do this, but I have the feel in general that they more and more are looking only for their own group victim and for their own group heritage, and have not the idea that that's a common thing and they have to work together.
Yeah, so definitely what we do not need is the hierarchy of sufferings. And we do not need the comparison for the sake of scoring more points, which unfortunately happens because, at least in our part of Europe, many people think, wow, the Jews won the competition, who has suffered the most. And they get the praise, they get reparations. So we also should participate in this competition. It sounds very cynical, but that's how it's perceived. People maybe do not formulate in this way, but that's how it's seen. So I don't think that we really need any sort of, or it's possible any sort of meaningful comparison. Yeah, we can and we should compare different crimes and different tragedies to find common patterns. It's an academic function. We know that Nazi policies against Jews were influenced by the genocide of the Armenians of 1915, by the American racial policies under Jim Crow laws, by the treatment of patients of mental hospitals in Europe, including such democratic countries as Sweden, and so on and so forth. So, and Switzerland, yeah, so we definitely have to compare these things, but it's not about saying that suffering of a Holocaust victim is 1 and suffering of, I don't know, Gulag prisoner is 0.8, and suffering of homosexual under Nazi regime in Buchenwald is 0.7 of it. Yeah, so in this sense, any comparison of suffering is useless and immoral, I would say. So we do not need to establish hierarchies. Yeah, I think and that's why I'm saying that we try to avoid tension of, between two memories. For example, in Latvia, between memory about the Holocaust and the memory of Soviet crimes.
I think my colleagues have covered the competition and comparison between the survivors or victims. I would like to touch upon a point which the IRA is dealing also a lot with. And since 7th of October, we all deal with the comparison of the Holocaust and what is happening in Israel and Gaza. And we had yesterday an ending of our discussion, which was a little bit rough because I'm very emotional on this, because we Europeans, if Israel falls, where do we go? So, and comparing what the Israelis are doing in Gaza with the Holocaust or with the Reichskristallnacht or with anything is just pure distortion. And we should be very careful to do such comparisons.
Okay, on that non-controversial point, I think we'll need to end. And thank you, everybody, for coming. It was a great panel. Karen is just going to remind everyone about the programming that's continuing. So we'll close with that.
Okay, and we want to be right on time. So I just will tell you that you're going to have lunch. Some people are going to the faculty club. Others are finding other places. I'm not sure how that's going to work, but there are students that will help.
I can answer some more questions on that. So in the back, there are some handouts with restaurants that are on campus. Those who are not going to the faculty club, you have opportunities and so many options on campus. You can also ask students. I can give you answers as to, there are students in the back waving who will tell you their favorite places to eat on campus. Additionally, we ran out earlier of bios and programs, and so we printed out some extras that are in the back. Please grab them. Additionally, there is an evaluation sheet for this event, which is a thing that we can give our donors that proves that you liked this event. It's very important to secure funding in the future. So if you can grab that, fill that out and give that to me or any of the other student employees, please do. Thank you.
So much. She's amazing. Just make sure we are starting 2 o'clock promptly in Sherman Hall, and we were starting with the ceremony, which our afternoon program continues with different presentations, but equally stunning and compelling. Thank you so much.